Good evening now, and welcome to the final session of what's been a fantastic day. And I think it's going to be a wonderful way to round up this tremendous summit we've had on the future of cities with the Globe and Mail. And what a panel we have of experts to get us thinking about culture and nightlife and the future of cities in that respect. I think it was Noel Coward who said that work is more fun than fun, but when work is fun, it becomes even more complicated. So hopefully our excellent panelists will be able to help us untangle that knot, but also to look forward to how to get through the rather more serious straits that lie ahead, to talk a bit about what they've been through as cultural leaders, entrepreneurs, and performers in their different fields in what has been a fantastically difficult year. And I'm very, very keen to hear from them about what they're going to be doing and what they think cities should be doing to get us past this very difficult period and into a future where culture can continue to be at the heart of city life, as it should be. I'm going to start, if I may, just by briefly urging you to look at the wonderful photo essay by Giulio Di Sturgo on Aerotropolis, which is my colleague John Jones, the picture editor, has organised, and is an amazing series of pictures that give you a sense of one of the many futures that cities may have. And my colleague Zav Greenwood has posted a link in the chat, so do take a look at that. But without further ado, I'm going to dive straight in and turn to Amy Lame, who's the Night Tsar of London, and also a very distinguished performer and radio host and many other things. But in this context, I think someone who we turn to for ideas and knowledge about what cities should do in the present predicament. Amy, so nice to have you here. Thank you very much for your time. Let's get straight into it. Obviously, the predicament facing bars, clubs, places of performance, the hospitality sector is immense, and the stop-go nature of lockdown has made it extremely hard for those businesses to plan. How have you tried to bring an element of strategy to this? And is perhaps an unfair question. And what do you think is the way ahead as we look forward to an early part of 2021, where there'll be a huge amount of questioning about when and how a vaccine might be available and what impact that's going to have upon all these services? So, you know, a huge intro question, but I think who better to answer it?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this panel and part of the whole discussion. It's a great honor. And I guess, first off, you know, just to start with one of the last points you made, Matthew, around the vaccine. A vaccine cannot come quickly enough for this industry. Look, London's nightlife is the best in the world. It plays a key role in our culture, and it's going to play a key role in our recovery. But what's clear is that this virus has had an absolutely devastating effect on the industry, and rightly so. The industry played their part in closing their doors and keeping the virus under control. And a lot weren't able to even reopen again before a second lockdown hit just a few weeks ago. And, you know, they still don't have any indication as to when they might be able to reopen. I think that there are some aspects of the industry that have suffered more than others. And I think that, you know, culture, hospitality, leisure, our grassroots live music venues have been particularly badly hit. So the kinds of things that we've been doing at City Hall is to support those most at-risk businesses, those most at-risk cultural places and spaces, the places that make London London, that if we lost them, you know, London would lose a bit of its soul. So those are like our grassroots live music venues, our LGBTQ plus spaces, our independent pubs and clubs. And so we set up with the Mayor of London a £2.3 million emergency fund to help some of those most at-risk small businesses. And we've been able to boost our culture at risk office to kind of give lots of guidance and support, because quite frankly, understanding the guidelines and the rules that have been issued by the government has been exhausting. I think it's fair to say. And it's also been really difficult to kind of get into some of the detail and how that works on the ground. I've also been heading up a Reopening High Street Safely task force at City Hall, which has enabled us to look at the kind of nuts and bolts of things like, legislation, regulation, and enforcement, and working really closely with local authorities, all the councils across London, working with my colleagues within City Hall, the Metropolitan Police, and business owners to make sure that when they do open, they open well and they're able to stay open. Unfortunately, we don't know what the next step is going to be when we come out of lockdown, hopefully in a couple of weeks. We do have a wish list, and one of those would be scrapping the 10 p.m. curfew, which is, in conjunction with all of the other uncertainty and difficulties businesses have faced. The 10 p.m. curfew has really hit the hospitality business the hardest.
Are you expecting a third lockdown in January?
I really don't know. At this point, I wish I was Mystic Meg. I wish I had a crystal ball. We don't even have any indication as to what might happen in a few weeks' time. And I think, with the number of U-turns that this government has made, we may well be into a lockdown. We may not be. It's really, really hard to tell.
Well, that's quite right, and sort of sums it all up. I'd like to turn now, if I may, to Nick Heitner, whom anyone who lives in London and indeed further afield will know. He's the co-founder of one of the great cultural institutions of the city and indeed the country, the British Theatre, and before that was for some years the artistic director of the National Theatre, and has been doing great work behind the scenes and indeed in front of the scenes to keep British culture going and city culture going during these very difficult times. Nick, here we are in the middle or towards the end of lockdown 2.0. How are you doing?
Okay. We're in rehearsal, because rehearsals and pre-production for theatre have been specifically allowed, as has TV and film production. So we are hoping that December 3rd, the day after the lockdown's supposed to end, we can reopen the Bridge Theatre. We're in a very fortunate position at the Bridge for various reasons. We were able to open at the end of August, although we're playing to 28% houses. We lose less money by being open than we do by shutting our doors. But of course, financially, it doesn't make any real sense for a theatre to be open at the severely reduced capacity that social distancing requires. We're also okay because we are hopeful that we will be able to finalise a loan from the government's Cultural Rescue Fund. And I think it is necessary to say that the Cultural Rescue Fund has been a good thing. There are many places it hasn't reached. The theatre is completely interconnected with the club economy and with the gig economy, and with restaurants and bars. It's so important to us that although we have been able, we hope at the Bridge, and many of my colleagues and ex-colleagues have already been able to take advantage of the Rescue Fund, that the work is done to make sure that when this thing is over, it can be reborn in something like its entirety. In the long term, once we do have a vaccine and once things are getting back to normal, you can look back through the millennia and you just know that at the heart of every great city has always been an interconnected cultural and club and night economy. One small historical nugget. In the 1590s, when Shakespeare's Globe first opened, there were 200,000 people in London, and every afternoon in the summer, 9,000 to 10,000 of them were at the theatre. That's 5% of the total city's population. Those who weren't at the theatre had also crossed the river to come to the brothels and taverns. So a massive chunk of the city has always been going to eat, to drink, to party, and to go see a show. And I don't see that not coming back, but a huge injection of cash and aid to make sure it does come back is necessary. Do that. And there's so many creative people in this city, in London, and I'm sure in every great city worldwide, that the rest will happen.
That seems to be the heart of the matter in this, and I'm sure it's the case in other cities as we'll go into here in the session, that what one's talking about here is really building a bridge to enable viable and often, hugely successful venues to get from A to B. And the distance between A and B is unknown, although it's a little bit clearer than it was before the announcements about the vaccines. But actually, when you look at the sums of money involved to keep the sector afloat, they're tiny in the broader scale of what's being spent and borrowed by the government. And I suppose the question is, how easy is it to get that message across as a cultural leader to people who are engaged in dispersing public funds, that actually this is an investment as well as a rescue package, so to speak?
It's never been easy, and for as long as I've been doing it, I thought it was a significant moment that when this government, a Conservative government, did announce its cultural rescue package, it announced it in terms that were new, as far as I can remember, to Conservatives. Culture, it said, performing arts, it said, were the beating heart of the community. They were at the center of what we hope to be as a society. We have all been so accustomed over the years to making the economic argument for government investment in our various sectors that came as rather a surprise, and it felt to me to be a good step forward. It's really difficult to keep up with the economic arguments that the various very brainy boffins at the Treasury are constantly requiring. It seems to me that as brainy as they are, and as arrogant as they are, the goalposts are constantly shifting, and we are always having to catch up to try to say what is obvious to the less well-educated compared to them, which is that if you have restaurants, if you have bars, if you have clubs, if you have theatres, if you have music, the economic multiplier is as plain as the nose on your face. But try telling that to the Treasury. It's an interesting other development that Neil Mendoza, who is a guy who has been charged by the government to be at the heart of the cultural recovery, is now saying that there may be other measures by which we can justify ourselves to governments, measures that other sectors of the economy have been using for some time. We may be able to justify ourselves in terms of well-being and mental health, if there can only be metrics that are acceptable to these really, really clever thugs who run the Treasury. That would be a great step forward. But meanwhile, it's tricky because the rules keep changing. This time, though, I want to circle back to this. This time, it was a good thing. It was an actively good thing they did when they unveiled their 1.6 billion cultural rescue package. And of course, what I hope is that help is extended elsewhere.
Absolutely. This segues nicely into a point that another member of our panel has made recently. Charles Caruth, I think you're there, Charles.
Hi.
Hi, how are you today? for this
Good,
evening?
good.
Yeah.
Well, today I is a bit of a tough day because we just kind of heard that tomorrow we're going into our second lockdown of the city, which will be devastating, which means we would have to lay off 99% of all staff. So it's going to come tomorrow, probably the announcement, but I heard from somebody close up to in the chain of command in the government that the lockdown is coming down tomorrow.
You, you referred recently in an article to the yo-yo handling of this pandemic, which I thought was a very apt phrase. And I know you own clubs and restaurants all over North America, Toronto, Niagara Falls, Montreal, Miami Beach, elsewhere. And that phrase seems to me to capture the problem, which is businesses that are perfectly viable, but obviously have been put into a kind of permafrost by totally external factors. And the logic is, how do you, as Nick was saying, how do you keep them going during a period of total uncertainty? And how do you persuade those who have public money to invest it in the right direction? Now, tell us what it's like in Canada. I mean, and Toronto, has there been that level of assistance?
Well, the level of assistance has been minimal, in my opinion. And also, for example, we had rent subsidies, but it only went as high as 50,000 Canadian dollars, where you would get help. So you would get 50% of that. Now, most of my locations are fairly large or in very prominent locations where the rents are higher than 50,000. Therefore, we were neglected completely to get any rental subsidy. And for that reason, I walked away from 2 locations where landlords were not willing to help at all. So the level of subsidy and help has been okay for some people, not good for some others like myself, and because of the size of the company. And it's been back and forth. It's coming in bits and pieces, and it's very tough to plan ahead when things are coming at you in bits and pieces. It's very, very difficult. We had somewhere around 2,300 staff before the pandemic, and we went down to 12 or 13 people only overnight. And then slowly, when we reopened, we brought the numbers back up halfway. But now, so many people have also decided to leave the sector. People that can no longer rely on, are we going back to work? When? Are we not? So the level of help hasn't been that great, no. Especially for nightclubs and live venues, which we have 4. One of them is the largest in Canada. It holds about 5,500 indoor and about 4,500 outdoor. So on any given day, we could do 10, 15,000 people. And for that reason, we're being penalized because the venue is too big to get any help. And we have a couple of live venues that have gotten also zero help from the government. It's weird. I think in Toronto, unlike London and Toronto, nightclubs are not looked at as anything great. People always look down on nightclubs.
Why should you be penalised for the scale of your venues, though? What's the logic of that criteria?
Well, because they said originally that the money is supposed to go to small business, and if you're past a certain volume or whatever, you are no longer part of a small business. So a lot of the financial help did not trickle down to our locations.
Do you also think, an interesting argument is that to some extent, restaurants are safer places for people to eat than in cramped houses. And that as long as social distancing and all the appropriate measures are taken, that restaurants need not necessarily have been closed during pandemic?
Well, listen, we have 15 restaurants in Toronto alone, and we have never had an infection come through our restaurants because of, the tracing that we do at the door, and we keep data, all the data and the tracing. We would have been notified by public health if we had anybody infected through the restaurants. We've had a few staff infected, and that was due to some staff going out and having drinks and partying after hours in people's homes, which is and was a big comment that I continue to make publicly, is that the shutdown in some ways backfires, because your 19, 20-year-old kid, your 30, your 40 maybe even, they are not going home to bed at 9 o'clock. And people are gathering in other people's homes. I also own a hotel in the city. So, some of the issues we've had to deal with, that people rent the suites, and then all of a sudden there's 20, 30 people there. So shutting down the restaurants that are very well monitored, where we manage very well, we've done all the social distancing, we get every week or 2 weeks, we get inspections, and we've always passed with flying colors. They've asked us to shut them down time and time again. And I think they're pushing people into people's homes and private venues where people are being infected, because there's, no one is paying attention, and there's no rules or regulations at people's homes.
Classic example of unintended consequences. Thanks for that, Charles. We'll come back to you in a second. Max Kerman, it's a delight to have you here, lead singer of Our Calls, and congratulations are in order for having got an album out, Campfire Call, during lockdown, which is no small achievement. It's a very fine
Thanks.
too. But before asking about the generality, I was very interested in one specific thing I know you and the band have been doing, which is the Flatten the Curve initiative. Can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, at the beginning of lockdown, I thought it'd be an interesting way to stay connected with our audience is just do some online lunchtime music lessons, just because I'm of the mind, if you can learn 4 or 5 guitar chords, you can play about 90% of popular music. And that's the reason why I started to learn how to play guitar. So I was very naive at the beginning of COVID back in March. I thought we'd be inside for about a week and then we'd get to go back and play again. But weeks turned into months, and we did 57 straight days of music lessons. And what made it fun at the time was it was very interactive. It was almost like chat roulette, where online people could request to join the chat, and I loop them in. There's no incidences of lewd behavior. Everybody was really good to be around. People were asking really good questions. And I was talking to people all over the world, people in the UK, people in the States, people all across Canada. And it was a really nice way to feel connected, especially during that uncertain time. I'd say there is a bit of screen fatigue, though. I'd say every artist, especially touring musician, is pretty fried when it comes to online concerts, online performances, and you really understand like how important just like the physical experience is. And as much as we're connected to our phones all day long, putting your phone down and being around people is something that you can never replace, and that's why this is so hard right now.
I mean, you don't join a band in order to stay at home. Clearly, that's number one. How do you feel about the prospects of touring in 2021? I mean, how positive and optimistic are you about that?
Yeah, well, we just got news. Obviously, everybody's heard the news about Pfizer and Moderna and the other pharmaceuticals that seem to have a vaccine. And I have, I know it's imperfect, but I do have faith in, the Canadian healthcare system to a degree to kind of start the organization process to getting it out to people. I know they're going to start with the people that are the highest risk, and that's going to start to roll out in January. We have a big hometown show on the board that was originally supposed to take place in June this past year, and it's been rescheduled for a year later in Hamilton. Yeah, there's over 20,000 tickets sold, and it's in the football stadium there. And we're really crossing our fingers that that can still happen for 2021. But it's hard to know. But I do know that, you know, I have a lot of, you know, friends and colleagues that are really hoping that we can begin to work again, because I think just as much as the financial part of this equation is important, the thing that I think has been hardest on everybody is the mental health component, where it's the waking up every day with a sense of purpose. And, you know, I was talking to our friend Tom, who's a trumpet player who tours with us and plays with everybody around the city. And he usually plays 8 times a week, 10 times a week. He sometimes will do 2 gigs in a night. And he's really social, he's lovely, he's really smart. And so much of his life is being around people. And he's been at home since March. And I know how hard that is for him and everybody like him, including myself. So I think that is, when we talk about the disconnect between the government and healthcare officials and scientists versus people that are in the arts, is like, how do we offer pathways to give people a sense of purpose every single day when they wake up? And it's one thing for the public messaging to be saying we need to stay ruthless, we need to stay vigilant, we have to stay apart, and I understand that, and that's really important. I think there's a whole other level of creativity involved when it comes to giving people who are normally out and about in the world creating art a sense of purpose every day. And I know for our band, we wake up every single day just racking our brains to stay busy, because it's the only way we can stay sane. And I know out of 100 ideas, we go, oh, no, I can't do that because, oh, what about that? No, can't. What about? And then we land on 1 out of 100 that we're like, okay, I think we can do this. Let's go to town on that. And that gives us a sense of purpose. So I think that's the one part, and I don't know who should be in charge, who's the committee for this, but who are the people that can help, at least if nothing else, give people a sense of purpose and community in a safe way. And I don't have a good answer for that, but yeah.
No, you've kind of lit on the question, which is who's in charge of the committee, because I guess you guys, you're thinking about, you know, the first time you get back on stage, you get back into a gig. Now the question is, what form will that gig take? Will it be socially distanced? We've seen performers around the world like Dave Chappelle doing comedy shows in Ohio that have been socially distanced and so on. Will people have to show vaccine certificates? I mean, these are important questions, but they're not necessarily questions that performers should have to answer. So the question is, are there people to whom you can consult and get at least halfway decent answers about these kind of questions?
Yeah, you need somebody in charge that can speak a lot of different languages, because I feel like when it comes to all these different lines of work, everybody kind of exists in their own silo and speaks their own language. And I think oftentimes there is a breakdown in communication. And ideally, that's what a good politician does, is able to talk to the healthcare officials, is able to talk to the doctors, able to talk to the industry. And so you need a facilitator in that role, and somebody who obviously puts their trust in science and in experts, but also can facilitate those conversations. Because it's one thing to say we need to get the cases down to 0, but it's another thing to also offer hope and a pathway for people who need, you know, some kind of fulfillment in the professional work, because it's also a huge part of the equation when it comes to, you know, the greatness of any city, as was discussed before, with how important the restaurants and theater and live music is to any city. These are all things that are all kind of running alongside each other, and they need to be able to speak to each other.
But I mean, to be clear, there is obviously no point of contact you've been offered where you can get reliable, up-to-date, real-time information on where things are going. Which is,
you know, we've had some outreach with some government officials, and we know there's some of the key promoters in town are in those high-level conversations. But yeah, I think you're right. That's a good point. I think there is a level of kind of communication and outreach to the artistic community that probably could be improved, because I think that people knowing more is really helpful.
Absolutely. Amy, I wanted to come back to you briefly on the basis of some of the things you've been saying in the chat about, which was kind of a disturbing element in all this, that actually a lot of the fund money that venues have got has gone on essentially paying back debts. So it gets people to, as it were, to zero, but it doesn't help them survive. That's correct, is it?
Yeah, and I think that perhaps earlier I painted a bit much of a bright picture when it came certainly to nightclubs. So a handful of nightclubs have been able to get part of money from the government's cultural recovery fund. This is unusual because, as Nick said earlier, the fund was expanded to include organizations that wouldn't normally get Arts Council funding. So a handful of nightclubs have been able to get that. But I don't want to paint the picture that the government actually respects nightclubs or believes in them in any way. There are two types of venues that have remained shut, mandatorily shut by the government since the beginning of March. And nightclubs are one of those types of venues. If you're wondering what the other one is, it's sexual entertainment venues. And I can tell you that nightclub owners and operators are, they are not one and the same thing. We don't have a roadmap for our reopening. And this is an industry that is worth £66 billion to the UK economy as a whole. Now, under what circumstances, let alone during a pandemic, and we're facing Brexit, can the government afford to ignore an industry that is worth £66 billion, is a huge driver for our economic recovery? It's part of that ecosystem, that Max has just been talking about, and Nick touched on as well, the restaurants and the clubs and the bars and the grassroots live music venues and the theaters and the late night shopping and, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is an ecosystem, and we need to start thinking of this as an ecosystem rather than demonizing certain parts of this creative and nighttime economy and saying, well, this bit is good because, opera is safe. Actually, anybody who's been to the opera can know that it can be quite edgy and dangerous sometimes. So I think that, we just need to kind of put things in a little bit of context. And say that, the government has done good things, and I do welcome the support, but they haven't gone in any way, shape, or form far enough, and especially for particular aspects of this economy, certainly nightclubs.
And Amy, how do you feel about this? There's been a lot of talk in cultural circles and indeed in policy circles about so-called mixed use. That one of the exits from the current dilemma is to encourage venues to proliferate the ways in which they're used. Is that a sound way of approaching it, or does it actually miss the point?
Yeah, well, look, a lot of these venues have been operating as mixed use for a very long time. I mean, take, for example, Ministry of Sound, one of the most famous club brands and a reason why, people travel from all over the world to come to London to go to Ministry of Sound. They use that venue to host events kind of just like this. If today was happening in real life, it's quite possible you may have wanted to have it at Ministry of Sound. They've got a world-class sound and video system, an amazing venue. Same with Printworks, another amazing club night, 5,000 capacity. So this isn't new, but what we don't want to do is dilute the reason and their very business model that it is founded on. And what is unfair is to expect small grassroots live music venues like the Dublin Castle, that is my virtual background, one of my favorite places in Camden, and expecting those smaller venues to all of a sudden open up and kind of sell coffee and croissant because that's diversifying. Actually, that doesn't work. Their main purpose is to take risks, to take cultural and creative risks in programming young up and coming bands. It's not to sell coffee and croissant.
No, absolutely. Well, undeniably so. Nick, returning to you, I mean, one question that sort of arises from all this is about people, and one imagines that for performers, not to mention people in all the other creative aspects of putting on performances. I mean, first of all, they rely on, they are, as are most performers, members of the gig economy in effect. But also, ballet dancers' muscles atrophy, and so in other words, the assumption that it's easy for performers just to sit at home waiting for Pfizer to be ready for clinical use is not really quite how it works. And it's very difficult to generalize, I'm sure, but how are performers coping with this particular period?
Well, it is hard to generalize, but a huge number of them are depressed and demoralized. Performers, as you say, are more or less all of them over here in the UK freelance. The ballet dancers who happen to be members of ballet companies, the musicians who happen to be members of symphony orchestras, they're in the minority, and they're doing better than the dancers who are waiting for the next West End show or touring show. They're suffering from what Max was describing, which is that tremendous need to get out, get together, and create. And there isn't an obvious solution. Where the solution isn't, although is in the digital world, although in the same way as venues are being told to diversify, performing organizations are being encouraged to transfer their energies to the digital world. A lot of it is good. There's stuff to be done. There are audiences to be found. There have been massive worldwide audiences who have, particularly when it was free, less so now that nobody can afford to make it free all of the time, but the massive audiences for live performance that was captured once upon a time. But the point about live performance is that it is live, and there will be a time, there will come a time, as long as we all survive, when the point of it once again will be its liveness. In the digital world, if you like, the USP of the performing arts and of the nightclub experience and the gig experience and the small venue experience, in the digital world, our advantage is that we aren't digital. So there is no long-term future in asking artists who are trained and whose vocation is to perform live. There's no long-term future in telling them to transfer their skills to digital. That digital will be merely a tool.
I suppose a follow-up question is to ask a version of what I asked Max, which is, I was lucky enough to see Ralph Fiennes perform the wonderful David Hare monologue, and I know he was doing several performances of that a day, and you had the bridge socially distanced, so presumably it was at 25-30% capacity, I'm guessing. Now, on the other side of a vaccine, how are you envisaging the sort of early stages of return? Will it still be socially distanced? Will you ask for proof of vaccines? I mean, how do you sort of phase that return to a full house?
Honestly, no idea. We'll be waiting for guidance. Our suspicion is that regulation will be outsourced to the venues themselves, maybe.
You mean you'll be left to your own devices?
On current form, it's possible.
Is that a bad thing?
Not necessarily. I mean, the venues that have opened in London have been extremely responsible and have taken social distancing very seriously. And as far as we know, up until the current lockdown, nothing was traced back to a live performance. It appears to be that a live performance, carefully regulated, is very safe. And an interesting thing has been, because we have had, until we closed down in 3 weeks ago, we have had audiences since late August, And you could not say that any one segment of the audience has stopped coming. Old people were coming, as far as I could see. This is purely, we have no data. I'm just saying what I was seeing. Older people in the audience were coming as much as younger people. I think the appetite for getting out and taking, if you like, the risk, that doesn't appear to correlate with age. So I think what will happen to begin with is that it will take time to get the entire audience back to where it was in February. There is already a large segment of the one I know is the theatre audience that's keen to get out. They know very, very few people were bothered by our demands that they wore masks, that they arrived at particular times. You know, they couldn't order drinks by standing at the bar, all that stuff. Everybody understood. I have no idea how and when those regulations will be relaxed, but I do think that there's already an audience that will come.
Do you think, Nick, that there is an extent, I mean, obviously the bridge is not an example of it, but to which the cultural sector generally has become too dependent upon state funding, and therefore when something like this happens, you know, it either sinks or swims, dependent on what goes on with the people you were describing in the Treasury?
No, I don't, and I think I don't think that. I think the UK cultural sector is extraordinarily entrepreneurial. The funding situation here in the UK over the last 20 years, certainly over the last 10 years, has meant that the subsidized sector has become has been required more and more to earn its own way. The cultural sectors in the rest of the continent of Europe is faring better because its income is less diminished than ours is, because so much of its income comes from the state. You look at the United States, where 0% of the performing arts income comes from the states, and they are in my American colleagues are in a much worse state than we are. We are finding it a lot more difficult than our European colleagues. But no, I've never come across anybody in my sector who doesn't know how to go out and earn money. This is literally having the doors closed has been literally the first time in my life that we have been left, you know, totally foxed. And everybody has had a go. You know, what I said about the digital world, sure, but a lot of people have made a go of it.
Absolutely. Charles, it's interesting to hear one of the common threads in all of this has been, you know, variant on Henry Kissinger's famous, the line that's attributed to Henry Kissinger, which is, you know, who do I call if I want to get in touch with Europe? Which is that the liaison between city authorities and national authorities in particular has been very hard. And I just wondered how you felt about the level of communication and the level of sort of information coming your way that's enabled you to any extent to plan.
I mean, funny enough, my level of frustration has gotten so high up there that yesterday we put out a letter to all the MPs, all the politicians, direct letters. And sure, we got an answer within 24 hours from everybody's assistant saying, as you know, so-and-so is very busy and we will get back to you when there's a chance. And there's an opportunity. I think the line of communications has been very minimal. We've had a couple of Zoom calls with the mayor. And when I was showing my level of frustration, there was this, well, you know, if you guys continue to complain, there's no sense of continuing this conversation. So I felt slighted really by, you know, the officials not taking a big part of our hospitality very seriously. I think there's a lack of respect in Toronto and Canada and maybe North America for clubs, including live venues. Restaurants get a little more respect, but you know, we employ about 1,500 people just on the nightclub side. So we, you know, it's a lot of money, a lot of taxes we pay, a lot of people we employ. Yet I don't think we're getting the level of, and that's something Amy touched on. You know, we're not looked at as a viable business, as a serious business, which is really sad because we are. And if you look at the effect we have on cities, as big as Florida is, Miami is the most well-known place in that part of that country because the amount of restaurants and bars and nightclubs they have and art scene that they have, a big art scene. And that has impacted the draw of talent, the draw of staff, the draw of tourism. And Miami is by far, you know, the most successful part of Florida. And it all goes back 100% based on its cultural side and clubs and restaurants and so on. So it's difficult. Depending on who is running the city, I think you're looked at in different ways. And unfortunately, I don't think Toronto has that leadership where they look at us as really a big part of what happens in the city and the draw and the amount of people we bring into the city and the amount of employees and the amount of taxes that we pay.
Thank you, Charles. I'd like to come now to Tanif, who's one of our excellent Tortoise ambassadors. Tanif, are you there?
Hello. Hi.
Thanks so much for joining us. Fire away.
Yeah, thank you so much. This event and the entire day has been really amazing. I'd love to be a part of it. What I was raising in the chat was the disproportionate impact that has happened and that has affected the industry, which is reliant on nightlife. And I was just thinking aloud as to how much of an impact could have been mitigated if there was a very elaborate and accurate test and trace system in place. Because as everyone has mentioned, most creative industries have had no cases or very limited cases reported from, for instance, theaters or restaurants and everything, because everyone was following the protocol that's prescribed. So I'm wondering, how much do you think the industry could have thrived even through a pandemic if this was properly in place?
Thank you. Actually, I wanted to put a variant of that to Max, which was to ask, you know, how much the infrastructure of test and trace is very, very poor in the UK, and this is in a way is one of the central failings of management of the pandemic. What's it like in Canada? And the follow-up to that was the generational dimension to this, which is, you know, to what extent are young people suffering disproportionately from what's going on in the cultural sector?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, there'd probably be somebody better to speak to how good the contract tracing is here. I know that you can typically, if you have symptoms right now, you can go get tested at the hospital and it's free. And if you are positive, they'll call you immediately and you're supposed to quarantine for 14 days. So that seems to be working somewhat effectively. But to that question, I thought that was an interesting question. It's like, what could we do? What sort of measures could be in place, you know, so industries wouldn't suffer so much, especially nightlife and the arts. And I'd say, like, we're in this completely unknown circumstance. And so I would say I have a little patience and understanding for government officials, especially at the top of this, where it is so unknown and so scary that if they give the wrong piece of advice and a bunch of people die, then it's their asses on the line. And I appreciate that. And so the extra level of caution that we've seen, especially in the beginning, it made sense to me, if I'm being honest. Now, the issue is sort of like the over policing and not being able to pivot quickly enough when we have new scientific evidence, you know, when it comes to certain quarantine periods or how the disease is transmitted. And that's something I'd like to see the government be able to move a little more quickly on. And, there was a real outrage at the beginning of the summer here in Toronto when the parks were packed with kids, and it didn't really, and everybody was publicly shaming all the young people that were hanging out at the parks and playing their guitars and throwing a ball around. And then it kind of proved later that I could be wrong with this, but I don't think it really was much of an outbreak center as everybody assumed it would be. So, as we move forward into the dark months, we're really looking for government to be thoughtful and creative, to recognize it's like, okay, can a restaurant have a patio space that's safe? Can we close down certain streets so people can congregate and drink a beer in the streets? Can we leave the park lights on a little bit longer so people can get fresh air? And of course, this isn't going to necessarily stimulate the economy, but I think for our collective mental health and to give some small businesses some opportunity to play. I'm sure Charles could speak to this better. It's like when it comes to like the licensing of selling beer, it's like, how can we make things easier for those vendors just to participate in the economy and to employ a few more people? Because I think it all does help without being regulated. Because Canada is a somewhat sort of has famously had like a heavy hand when it comes to regulations. Like, if you're caught in the street with a beer in your hand, you can get a ticket. And I know in Germany, that's not the case. So how can we use some common sense to make things a little bit easier as we're going through this unprecedented time?
Charles, do you want to add anything to that? Because that seemed an invitation to you to solve the problem.
Well, I mean, you asked how is tracing here, and what happened a couple of months ago, Toronto Public Health made an announcement that they can no longer maintain tracing of all cases, and that we were responsible in our own venue, which at the time was mainly the restaurants, to trace back anybody who was to get sick. So they have fallen behind as cases went up. They were not able to keep, you can never keep going. As cases go up, you need thousands of people to, there's only so many calls somebody can make in one day. But, I want to second, what Max was saying. We in Canada are very stringent and we're very strict with our liquor laws. This summer, we were allowed to do a lot more than usual. And I sure hope that they will allow us to maintain the same kind of relaxed measures that we had this past summer in the future, because it really brought the city, made it a lot more alive than it has been. So, in some ways, hopefully I'm trying to get some of the positive from this pandemic and see how in the future we can learn some of the lessons on what we had to deal with to hopefully be able to somewhat catch up and get back to normality.
We're fast reaching the end of the hour. Just before we do, I wanted quickly to come both to Amy and to Nick, just to give us a bullet point wish list of what you'd like to see. What are your wishes for Christmas to get us out of this? Let's go with Amy first.
Well, a vaccine, a vaccine that is widely available, cheaply available, quickly distributed. I think that, test and trace has been a disaster in the UK and no one takes it seriously. And so, really a vaccine is our only way out. I think the other asks that I would make would be an extension of business rates holiday, that the government should do that well into next year to enable businesses to recover financially, just to give them that extra boost. And we need to scrap the 10 p.m. curfew. We're meant to be coming out of lockdown in 2 weeks' time. If we go into tier 2 or tier 3, we will, as it stands now, be under a 10 p.m. curfew. This decision is based on no science, no evidence, and no data. This is all about a very ill-conceived notion of that the virus somehow disappears. you know. So we really need that to be scrapped.
Okay. Nick, what tidings of comfort and joy do you want?
Well, I agree with absolutely everything that Amy just said. But I would, I'd also say that in the UK at least, the Cultural Rescue Fund has been a great start, and those who have been able to benefit from it will probably get through to the end of the pandemic and start to be able to rebuild. Two things need to happen. One is that what started needs to be continued, because a lot of the producing organizations who've been helped will need help to thrive again once they've survived. But second, there really isn't any difference between the opera and a nightclub. In many respects, it's the same people, it's the same impulse, it's the same city center. So those parts of what make a city worth living in that Cultural Rescue Fund isn't reaching, there's got to be found a way of getting to them. So because if they get through to the other end and are able to start again, all sorts of good stuff will happen. They'll be at the center. We will be at the center of the rebuilding, of the healing, of the coming together. So it is as ever back to the interconnectedness of high culture and low, of the performing arts and the hospitality sector.
Absolutely, and I can't think of a better way to end the session. And I'd like to thank everyone who's been here for the session and indeed for the whole day, and to the Globe and Mail for being such fantastic partners. And I'd love to, if I may, close by handing back to our editor-in-chief and co-founder, James Harding, to say a few words to close off the event. James.
Matt, thank you. I'm sitting here with this wide smile on my face, because the whole subject of how opera and nightclubs are the same and interchangeable. I'm certainly sitting here thinking to myself, Nick and Amy, I would love a little opera to be a little bit more like nightclubs. That would be, that would definitely be an improvement to the arts and culture sector, no doubt. I wanted to say sort of one substantial thing and then one heartfelt thing. The substantial thing was that when we started this conversation with the Globe and Mail about hosting a day to think about the future of cities, I suppose there was something that was frightened about the discussion to come, that something really fundamentally dangerous was happening to cities, and that they would never quite be the same again. And that was the nature of the conversation in the summer when we started. Would they come back, and if so, how and what was needed? The thing that's been completely exciting about today has been the reality of a conversation where we didn't duck the fact that cities are really challenged by what's happening, that fundamental changes are not going to be just a function of this period of the pandemic, but will last. But this sense that we could be in for an extraordinary 20s, that even if you take into account what we heard right at the beginning about the period of the next year or two, 2020, 21, the regeneration of the cities, the idea of the corrected city, how much cities are going to be transformed. And it's funny, I was reading the Globe and Mail's coverage of the future of cities, and they quoted one of the great heroes of tortoise, a woman called Jane Jacobs, who wrote that great book, The Death and Life of American Cities. And it's a good place for us to be thinking about cities now, cities that are certainly not dead, but feel a little dormant and are going to come back to life. And it feels as though today's conversation has looked ahead at the ways in which they can and should come back to life. And it's no bad thing for a group of people in Canada, a group of people in the UK, and I'm proud to say all over the world, to think about death and then life in that order, particularly when it comes to our cities. And then I wanted to say something that was heartfelt, which is these things are a pleasure. I've seen these lovely comments from people saying what a pleasure it is to be a part of. The truth is they're a pleasure to do. It's absolutely amazing treat as a journalist to sit in on these conversations, and certainly to edit and chair them. They're a pleasure to do. They're a nightmare to organise. And the people who've organised it are our colleagues at the Globe and Mail, not just David Wormsley, but his whole team there. And over my shoulder, you'll see one person called Imi Harper, who's more or less had to, carry this thing for weeks and months. You can't even see her. There you are, Imi. You have to wave. That's it. That is the one-woman engine. That is, there she is, driving the future of cities, the future of cities all over the world, not least the ones we love. So a big thank you to the teams that's made this possible. I know it's not just Imi, it's a whole group of people, but she's really owned it. So a big thank you to lots of people are starting saying thank you to Imi. So a big thank you to everyone. A thank you, of course, to the AND Partnership and to Fora, who've sponsored it and made it possible for us to hold this day. A huge thank you to the gang. Forgive me, Matthew, I'm kind of encroaching on you, but thank you to Amy and to Nick and to Charles and to Max and all the people who've just joined us for this last session. But the biggest of all, thank you to you for informing us and enlightening us by sparing the time that everyone has joined us through the course of this, which is our first summit with the Globe and Mail, and I hope the first of many to come. Have a great afternoon, late morning, early evening, wherever you are in the world. Make the most of your city. Thanks so much.